So, welcome back to the second half of our session. We have two more talks. And the next one is by Katharina Wilmes on neural mechanisms underlying predictive processing in uncertainty. Katharina, we are looking forward to your talk.
Thank you very much for the introduction. It's already there. Sorry. Yes. I thought I would see the screen also here. No, it's just there. Okay, that's fine. Okay, thank you very much for the introduction. I will talk about predictive processing in uncertainty. So predictive processing refers to the idea that our brain maintains an internal model of the outside world based on which we can make predictions about our sensory experiences. Now, to predict those sensory experiences, they need to be encoded in neural activity. And therefore, to be precise, the idea behind predictive processing is that higher level areas predict the activity in lower level sensory areas. And if our model of the world is incorrect, or the world recently changed, so basically our model is incorrect, then this may result in a prediction error, which is sent back to the higher level area. Now, this can occur across many processing stages. And basically, the idea is that behind predictive processing, sorry, I'm a bit confused now. Yes, so before, so what we actually know from behavioral studies is that higher level areas influence the processing on a lower stage. And before I give you examples about this, I would like to give you a little bit of context of predictive processing. So predictive processing is an algorithm which solves the computational objective of minimizing prediction errors and can be implemented in cortical circuit. And since we are at the neuromorphic meeting, it means that it could also be implemented in neuromorphic circuits. And this looks a lot like math 3 levels. However, I would like to introduce another level, namely the cognitive function, and distinguish between cognitive function and computational objective. Both of them belongs to math computational level. And the cognitive function that predictive processing solves is perception and learning. And in the next slides, I will show you why predictive processing is an algorithm for perception and learning. So why is predictive processing an algorithm for perception? When we perceive something, we rarely perceive what is actually there. Instead, we perceive a combination of what we expect to see and what is there. So we integrate our prior beliefs with the current sensory information. And visual illusions very nicely show that this is the case. For example, most people perceive a bump on the left and a hole on the right. And although these two disks are exactly the same, just one is turned by 180 degrees. And this can be explained by us having grown up on Earth where light comes from above. So if light comes from above, a bump is light on the top and a hole is light on the bottom. So we have this light from above prior, which influences our perception. Another visual illusion is the Ponzo illusion, where we perceive the top orange bar as being larger than the bottom orange bar because of the train tracks that introduce a perception of depth. And finally, in many perceptual tasks, we observe something called a central tendency effect, or also referred to as contraction bias, which refers to the effect that the perception of a stimulus is biased towards the mean of previously observed stimuli or towards a prior belief. So this is a study by Petschner and Glasauer where they placed subjects in a virtual reality and they displaced them by a certain distance. And afterwards, they had to reproduce the same distance. And you can see here on the y-axis that the reproduced distance is biased towards the mean of the actual true sample stimuli or replaced distances that they were replaced by. So predictive processing actually can explain the central tendency effect because it assumes that the current representation are on some level in the brain, which can be thought of as the perception that we currently have is influenced by both the bottom-up and the top-down information. And this is the sensory information and the prior information. Now, what about uncertainty? I said in the beginning I will talk about predictive processing in uncertainty. And that is because we live in a world which is very noisy and variable and hence very uncertain. And predictive processing provides an answer to this, how we should deal with uncertainty, and defines perception as Bayesian inference, where prior and sensory information are weighted by their uncertainties. So let me give you an example. Imagine you are in a dark room, then your sensory information is pretty unreliable. And hence, you can use your memory, which gives you a prior, to navigate in this room nevertheless. So in the dark room, you would like to weight your prior more than your sensory information. However, if you just arrived here in your hotel room and you don't know the room very well, then also your prior is very uncertain. And then the best you can do is switch on the light to increase the reliability of your sensory information, so you rely more on the sensory information than on the prior. So this is the base optimal integration of prior and sensory information, and it has been shown in behavioral studies that humans are kind of base optimal in these perceptual tasks. So what about learning? Predictive processing is also an algorithm for learning because we can learn from the prediction errors and we can update our model to generate a better prediction based on these prediction errors. Learning from errors in general has been found fruitful in ICNCE, for example, and also to predict the sensory input means that learning becomes self-supervised because it does not require magical targets. And finally, predictive processing is a great algorithm that can be implemented in cortical circuits and maybe also neuromorphic circuits because it only requires local information. And learning corresponds to changing the weights in this predictive coding algorithm, and that happens only after we inferred the optimal representation. So what about uncertainty during learning? So predictive processing is a pretty straightforward algorithm for learning without any uncertainty. We just learn until there's no prediction error left. But what about a variable world? This does not necessarily work because in the world we have lots of stimuli that are distributed according to some distribution. Let's assume a Gaussian. Then even if we already are statistically optimal with our prediction, that is, we predict the mean, even then we would still get prediction errors because of this distribution of the stimulus samples. And therefore, it's important that we actually learn about the variance. And I would like to give you an example why it's important to have a representation of the variance. So, for example, imagine there's a person at the bus stop who learned that buses are pretty unreliable, maybe someone from Germany. They have a prior expectation of the bus arrival times, which can be described by a very wide Gaussian distribution. Now, if the bus is late, they are not surprised and they remain calm. Now, if another person, maybe from Switzerland, has a very narrow expectation of the bus arrival times, because buses are quite punctual in Switzerland, then if the bus is late, they might be surprised, might get nervous, but they can learn from this experience. They can update their estimate of the variance. And maybe if they are actually in Switzerland, where the uncertainty is very low of the bus arrival time, this might indicate that the bus schedule changed. So it is important to distinguish meaningful prediction errors that result from a change in the environment from prediction errors that are just the result of noise. So to summarize, perception can be understood as Bayesian inference, where the prior and the sensory information should be weighted based on their uncertainties, and learning, when we learn from prediction errors, we should take into account the uncertainty because it determines how much we rely on prediction errors. And we can also formally derive these principles with a normative approach by formulating an objective. And our objective here is to find the prediction that maximizes the likelihood of observing the sensory input given the prediction. And this gives us a cost function or an energy that needs to be minimized, which we have here is the negative log likelihood. And to get our update for the representation, we take the gradient of this energy with respect to the current representation. This is our inference or perception step. And we can see that the update depends on both the bottom-up prediction error, which is the difference between the current sensory input and the prediction from the current representation, and also on the top-down prediction error, which is the difference between the current representation and the prior or the higher level top-down prediction. And we can see here that both these errors should be modulated by the respective uncertainty on each level. Now, for learning, we can get the weight update by taking the gradient of the energy with respect to the weights, and we also get the bottom-up prediction error weighted by the inverse of the uncertainty. So in both these cases, for both inference and learning, they rely on prediction errors that are modulated somehow by uncertainty. So the question now that I was wondering is whether we find such uncertainty-modulated prediction errors in cortical microcircuits. And fortunately, there's a physiological basis for prediction errors that we find in the mouse brain, for example. Most of these studies are from the visual cortex, from Georg Keller's lab, but it has also been found in other modalities and also in a higher brain area, which is called the posterior parietal cortex. And our collaborator, Shankar Sachidanandam, at the University of Bern finds these prediction errors there. And to elicit a prediction error, they do the following paradigm. They have a mouse, and they first present a tone to the mouse, which is followed by a whisker deflection. So the mouse has little magnets on the whiskers, and they turn on a magnet, and then the whisker deflects to a certain degree. And they do this repeatedly, such that after a while, the mouse expects already by hearing only the sound that there will be coming this whisker deflection. And to elicit the prediction error, what they do is they present a whisker deflection which is stronger than the one the mouse experienced before. And they look at cells in so-called layer 2-3 of the posterior parietal cortex, and they find that there are some cells that respond only when the mouse makes this prediction error. So they do not respond when everything happens as expected. So this is the perfect starting point to look at these cells in posterior parietal cortex and the circuits they are embedded in, to ask how do these circuits compute prediction errors, and are there uncertainty modulated prediction errors in these circuits. So here I would already like to point out that these circuits consist of different cell types. So they are not just the error neurons, but they are also different cell classes, the inhibitory cells, and they come in certain circuit motifs. So they can actually do very interesting computations, and we were wondering what these computations are. So to formalize the task of the mouse, let's assume the mouse has to predict the whisker stimulus intensity based on a sound, and to introduce uncertainty, we sample the whisker stimulus intensities from a Gaussian distribution. Now, this gives us the uncertainty modulated prediction error, which tells us how to update the mean prediction with each sample or stimulus that we observe. And this is the difference between the stimulus and the current prediction, and also modulated by the inverse of the uncertainty. So again, the uncertainty modulated prediction error. And we were wondering whether these cells in layer 2-3 that show error activity are actually uncertainty modulated. And because every error, no matter whether it's uncertainty modulated or not, depends on whether the stimulus is larger or smaller than expected. So that is, it can be either positive or negative, but firing rates are always positive. We have a bit of a problem here, and therefore it has been suggested that there are two types of error neurons. One of them signals positive errors, and the other one signals negative errors. So therefore, we have to split up our prediction error into these two terms, the positive and the negative one. And for the talk, I will focus on the positive prediction error neurons. And the question is whether they can actually compute the difference, the uncertainty modulated prediction error. And to do that, they need to have access to the stimulus. And because we are in posterior parietal cortex, it receives inputs from the somatosensory system, and there are even cells in PPC that respond to somatosensory stimuli. We can assume that these cells could also receive an excitatory stimulus input. Then they need to subtract the prediction. PPC also receives auditory inputs from the auditory system, so they could receive some higher level representation of the sound input that makes a prediction, but this prediction needs to be subtracted. And as I just told you, there are interneurons in these circuits that provide inhibition to these cells. And there are also interneurons that provide so-called subtractive inhibition. So they could do the subtraction, and it has been shown in the study by Wilson et al. That the so-called somatostatin positive interneurons provide subtractive inhibitions, and we call them SST in brief. Then you can see that we also need to modulate this error term divisively by the uncertainty, and we also find, surprise, divisive interneurons in these circuits, and they are called the PVs, the parvalbumin positive interneurons. Therefore, we hypothesized that the SSTs could reflect the mean, and the PVs could learn the uncertainty, such that in the end, the layer 2-3 neuron could calculate the uncertainty modulated prediction error. To investigate whether these cortical circuits with different cell types can actually locally learn to predict means and variances of their inputs, we simulated a little rate-based circuit model consisting of different cell types, consisting of the error neurons and also the SSTs and the PVs. And we were wondering whether we can learn some weights from a higher level representation of the sound, which is predictive of the upcoming stimulus, to the SSTs, such that after learning, the SSTs reflect the mean of the distribution. So what we do is we present to the model a sound stimulus together with samples from the somatosensory stimulus distribution, which is a Gaussian. And then we modify the weight according to a local activity-dependent plasticity rule, which is a very simple target-based rule called also the Obanchik and Zen rule. And then we find that the SST firing rate after learning actually represents the mean of this distribution. And this works for different means. And so we can see that the average rate predicts the mean after learning. Now, the more interesting case is we ask whether we can also learn weights from the sound representation to the PVs such that the PVs reflect the variance of the inputs after learning. And to remind you to compute the variance, we need to subtract the mean from the stimulus samples. Now, interestingly, the PVs receive inhibitory inputs from the somatostatin positive cells such that they have all the information available to calculate this quantity. Now we present two different sounds with two distribution with different variances to the model, and we find that after learning, the PV firing rate on average can predict the uncertainty. And to give you an intuition why this works, essentially the PVs receive both the stimulus input and also the subtraction of the mean. So they receive the stimulus, mean subtracted stimulus, which is a variable target. And although it's an unsupervised rule, it is kind of a target for the learning, and the expected value of this target is proportional to sigma. Now, if we have a quadratic activation function in the PVs, we can see that the output firing rate on average becomes the variance, or proportional to the variance. So let's consider a toy example where we now learn the mean representation in a representation neuron, which receives input from both positive and negative prediction error circuits. I didn't introduce these negative prediction error circuits, but they are basically the mirrored version of the positive prediction error circuits. And not surprisingly, this works, so we can learn the mean of the distribution in the firing rate of the representation neuron. But what I would like to actually talk about is the dynamics of this learning process. So let's look at the firing rate evolution of these representation neurons. And here we can see that, so here we compare actually an uncertainty modulate prediction error circuit with an unmodulated circuit, and we can see that the UPE circuit learns more slowly, but then also has reduced fluctuations in the firing rate compared to the unmodulated circuit. And this process basically reduces the fluctuations in the representation. However, if the uncertainty is low, we can trust our samples more. So with the uncertainty modulate prediction error circuit, we actually learn faster than in the unmodulated case. So the UPE basically gives us something that automatically adjusts the learning rate based on the uncertainty. Now finally, UPEs can also implement the base optimal weighting of prior and sensory inputs that I was talking about earlier. If we now have a hierarchical model where we do not just get the bottom-up prediction errors to the representation neuron, but also from the higher area or the local area, which also includes uncertainty modulation by the prior. So we do not just have the uncertainty of the stimulus, but also the prior. And then we can vary these different uncertainties, and we can see that if we increase the prior uncertainty, then we rely more and more on the stimulus sample, so the central tendency effect gets weaker. However, if we increase the sensory uncertainty, then we rely less on the sensory input, so the central tendency effect gets much stronger, which makes sense. So with this, I would like to summarize part one. So the theory predicts that prediction errors for learning should be modulated by the uncertainty, and that different elements of cortical circuits can compute means and variances and uncertainty modulate prediction errors, is what we showed in a small circuit model with local activity-dependent plasticity rules. Our model makes predictions for different cell types, which I didn't show now, but you can check them out actually in the peer-reviewed preprint. And finally, the uncertainty modulate prediction errors reduce the fluctuations and enable adaptive learning rates. And with this, I would like to come to another project which is very much related. This is the PhD project of an excellent PhD student in the lab, Arnaud Granier, who I was lucky to work with. And here we suggest that uncertainty should be a function of immediate higher level activity. So here the idea is that the higher level does not only predict the mean of the lower level, but also its variance or uncertainty. So why should uncertainty be a function of higher level activity? The cortex or the brain is organized in a very hierarchical manner where representations become more and more abstract along the hierarchy. And when we think of the brain as a predictive or generative machine, then this means that the more abstract representations predict the lower level, more detailed representations. For example, if we are in the context of a tropical forest, we might predict that there may also be some bananas. And if we have a representation of the banana, then we can predict that on a lower level in the cortex, we might see the feature color yellow. So it is conceivable that the variability on each level somehow depends on the higher level category. But to make this more obvious, let me give you an example. So if our current representation is a banana, then the color feature is predicted to be yellow in the lower level, and this higher level can be quite confident about its predictions because bananas are usually yellow. However, if the current representation is an apple, then the higher level cannot be so confident because apples can appear in very different colors. So here we see that the variability on the level can depend on the higher level category, so it makes sense that the higher level can also predict the variability or uncertainty on the lower level. So to derive the neuronal dynamics for learning this, we again took an energy-based approach where now we define an energy that defines the objective that the cortex should minimize. And on the one hand, the cortex should minimize prediction errors, and on the other hand, it should maximize the confidence. And here, the confidence is the inverse of the uncertainty indicated by pi. And note that because we apply a confidence normalized or variance normalized norm to the errors, the errors also increase with the confidence. So this is a bit of a side effect. So we can derive our neuronal dynamics from this energy by taking the gradient with respect to the current representation, which we call U here. And we get something that looks like this. So we have a leak term, we have the prediction input, and we have errors which are gain modulated by the uncertainty. So for the neuro people here, this resembles a bit the membrane equation from a parameter cell, for example. And these errors, here we see we have two kinds of errors now. On the one hand, we have the classical prediction errors on the mean prediction, which are again modulated by uncertainty, as I presented before. But on the other hand, we have a new kind of error, which we call the second order error, which is the error on the variance estimate. And we can also see that our classical prediction errors are on the one hand modulated by the confidence on the lower level, but also by the uncertainty of the higher level. And this twofold modulation gives us a dynamic balancing of top-down and bottom-up streams, similar to a Bayes optimal weighting of these two streams, which I will illustrate in the following. So here now some colorful examples. So if on some level we have a representation that predicts a lower level feature about which it can be quite confident because it is not very variable. For example, if we have a tree representation, then we can be quite confident that we will see a trunk and branches because that is what trees usually have. And therefore, if we do not see trunk and branches, so we make an error, then we would like to scale that error up because then it's probably not a tree that we are seeing. So depending on our confidence, we want to listen more to the sensory error. If now we predict the feature leaves, which are not always there, so in winter trees don't have leaves or some trees have needles instead, then we are not very confident about seeing leaves. So if we do not see leaves, that doesn't mean that we are not seeing a tree. So we do not want to listen to this kind of error very much, and therefore we do not scale it up. Now, the current representation, how much it's influenced by this error, should not only depend on the lower level category, but also on the higher level context, so our prior, basically. And if we are, for example, in a forest, then we can be quite confident that we will see trees, so we do not listen that much, actually, to the errors that are coming from not seeing trees. This is similar to the room example, where we are quite confident that we know the room, so we actually do not need to listen so much to the sensory information. Now, in another context, when we are in the city, we might not encounter so many trees, so our confidence is low, and then we actually want to listen to the sensory information to know whether we are seeing a tree or not. So both the lower level and the higher level confidence or uncertainty should influence how much we listen to the sensory errors. And we can show that this actually gives us a Bayes optimal weighting of the cortical streams. So our method here is very similar to Bayes optimal, while if we do not take confidence into account at all, or if we just take the mean precision or confidence, then we are much worse. Okay, so in the last few minutes, I would like to talk about why it is useful to calculate second-order errors and to propagate them in the cortical hierarchy. So what we've shown here is that we suggests that the higher area does not only predict the mean, but also predicts the confidence, or learns the confidence of its prediction. And we basically compare this confidence estimate with the actual magnitude of the errors, which gives us a more true confidence estimate. And then this gives us the second order errors that are propagated up in the hierarchy. And importantly, they also influence the higher level activity. And we learn both the mean and the confidence by taking the gradient of the energy with respect to the weights that we want to learn. And we see that what we get out are Hebbian-like learning rules that rely on the presynaptic activity as well as the post-synaptic error. And also here we can see that our learning of the mean is modulated by uncertainty as before. So when the variability is high, we rely less on the errors for learning. Now, what is the advantage of having the propagation of second-order errors? We can show that we can actually do nonlinear classification in a single area with this. So here we have a simple binary classification task with a very simple network with two output neurons that indicate the chosen class. So, and here we have x and y coordinates that are the input to the network. And here we can see the true classes that they belong to. We have the blue and the green class. And then we can see that if we do not propagate the errors, the simple network cannot solve this problem because it's not linearly separable. However, if we introduce the delta prop, so the propagation of second-order errors, we can actually classify these points quite well. And with this, I would like to summarize. In the second part of the talk, we formally derived neuronal dynamics from an energy function that minimizes prediction errors. And we suggest that cortical areas should not only predict the activity itself or the mean representation, but also the confidence in their predictions. The theory predicts the existence of cortical second-order error neurons, so another kind of error neuron. And why is this useful? So we show that this implements the Bayes optimal integration of bottom-up and top-down cortical streams, where there's lots of behavioral evidence that humans can do this. And finally, it allows for nonlinear classification in a single area. And with this, I would like to thank Arno for his amazing work, and also our PIs, Walter Senn and Mihail Petrovic, and the entire theoretical neuroscience group at the Institute of Physiology at the Institute of Bern. And thank you very much for your attention. Happy to answer your questions.
Thank you very much, Katharina, for the concise talk. We have time for questions.
Hi, I am a student from RWT Jharkhand. So thank you really for the good talk, and I really enjoyed it. I have a question, like what about the exceptional cases when our perceiving and the prior doesn't work? Suppose you give the example of a room, like when the switch is not defined, so the pattern is not really reliable. Sometimes the switches are other side and we don't know where the switch is, and the light is off. So in that case, and the bus stop is like, suppose there is not a pattern how the bus is disrupted in the route, so the people is always impatient. So does this model all take care of those exceptions also, or is like we really need a lot of work to do?
Yeah, I mean, if the uncertainty is low for both the prior and the sensory information, then yeah, of course you cannot rely on either of them. So you will not navigate very well in the room, right? You can also see it in the behavior that.
So like for the in my perspective, for getting the prior, we really need a pattern. And if there is not a really the pattern to create a prior, like suppose there are like 10 rooms, and every time when you go into the room, there is a switch on the right side. And there are some rooms where switch is on the not right side, so there is not a reliable pattern. So I cannot create the pattern in my mind. So how can we rely on the predictiveness if there is no pattern? How can we decode that like in our brain? So we really need a pattern to create a model which really works on that. Is it like?
I'm not sure I'm getting the question, to be honest.
Like to create a prior, like you said,
yes.
When you go into the room, you know where is the desk, where is the bed is. So there is a pattern that you all every day seeing in your room. So your mind interrupt, okay, there is a bed every time so you create a memory of it. But
Yes.
sometimes when there is no pattern, like you go in a random place and the position is changing, always
Okay.
changing. So there is no pattern. So how can you encode that information in our brain?
I see. Of course, the model is too simple to account for this kind of stuff, but basically your memory does not only include the current room, but also your experience with other rooms. So you might look for the light switch close to the door, where usually light switches are, etc. So your prior is not only influenced by this particular room, but your entire experience of the world. And of course, this model is oversimplified, right?
Okay.
It's more about, it's not really defining how we learn the prior, what the prior is in itself, but only how this could be weighted on a circuit level when we have top-down and bottom-up input. So it's a bit, you're right that we probably need a bigger theory to account for all these things. So this is more a theory about just how are they weighted if we have already a sensible prior.
Okay, so we can say it's just a beginning of what we want to have in the...
I think in the interest of others, we should move to another
thank you.
question now. But maybe you can continue in the lunch break.
Okay.
Now here.
So thanks for the talk. Maybe she's looking. Okay. Thanks for the talk. And maybe my concern is also related to the first one. So in order to define the error, I think you really have to define the system size that is actually controlled by boundary conditions. So at least this theory needs a little bit including the boundary condition. So I think that will be a good point that a little bit improving the theory. Okay, so that's just the comments that I had, the first question.
Okay.
Okay.
Then last question, please.
Yeah, thank you very much for your nice presentation. My name is Timo Oster from TU Darmstadt. I've got a question about, if we now want to implement what you have learned about those prediction errors into networks that we build ourselves, on which levels should we estimate those errors? On the really small details or on the global scale where we have really abstract concepts? So should this be something that every single cell that we build tries to measure, this prediction error, or should this be only used intermittently on larger scales?
That's a very good point. So if we really assume this Bayesian framework, it actually predicts then that you have the uncertainty modulation on every level where you also have an error. Mm-hmm. I mean, of course, you might think on some levels it's more important to measure uncertainty than on others. So especially when it comes to decision making and being conscious about the uncertainty, that might require even a different kind of uncertainty representation, which is more explicit. And this is more the idea that on every level where you actually compute an error, you should also take into account the uncertainty, and it might not be a conscious thing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, okay, thank you.
My pleasure.
Thank you. Let's thank Katharina again.